dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Hello everyone, it's Eric here and I am back with another video. Now I haven't made a video of this, like this rather, in a long time, of me speaking to my camera about a particular social issue that interests me. If any of you are familiar with the OG Eric Osa content, you know that I used to do this all the time. But over the past few months, what I've done is I've invited guests onto my YouTube channel and engage in authentic, extensive dialogue with my guests about a particular subject that they specialize in and a subject that intrigues me. Well, I'm going to be returning to releasing content like this, and videos that I make like this of me independently, singularly speaking to a particular social issue will go out on my YouTube channel exclusively. Whereas conversations that I have with guests who I invite onto my channel will go out both on my YouTube channel but also on my podcasting platforms. If you'd like to see videos like this, the audio of videos like this, be shared onto my podcasting platforms too, be sure to let me know in the comment section. I'll ensure that I make your wish come true. Now, before getting into the crux of this video, I think it's important to state what this video is not. I am not proselytizing in this video or attempting to evangelize or to impose any specific religion or religion as a general subject, for that matter, upon anybody. Instead, what I want to encourage is all-encompassing rational thought about all of the facets that go into producing the human experience. I believe one of the most fundamental facets that has been attached to our experience as human beings for nearly as long as we've been is religion, and therefore I think it's worthy of critical and open-minded analysis. I also want to encourage the idea that we can make space for the concept of religious truth and also appreciate the deeply embedded value in a lot of religious traditions that believers and non-believers alike can gain from. It's important for me to state also that the reason why I wanted to make this video was how I felt after reading this book. This book is called God is Not Great, and it's written by a man called Christopher Hitchens. Now, Christopher Hitchens was a critic, an author, a phenomenal thinker, and figurehead, generally speaking. And he was an essential part of the new atheist movement. And this movement essentially culminated, I think, at the start of the 21st century, and it saw atheistic thinkers contribute to a tirade, I would call it, against religion. A lot of criticisms were posed by the new atheists against religion, and they were essentially advocating for the idea that the best possible way to perceive the world was a way that accounted for rationalism, objective scientific truth, and rejected what they saw as the mysticism that came in the form of religion. So let's get into the video, shall we?
So when I say, as the subtitle of my book, that I think religion poisons everything, I'm not just doing what publishers like and coming up with a provocative subtitle. I mean to say it infects us in our most basic integrity. It says we can't be moral without Big Brother, without a totalitarian permission. It means we can't be good to one another. It means we can't think without this. We must be afraid. We must also be forced to love someone who we fear. The essence of sadomasochism, the essence of abjection, the essence of the master-slave relationship, and that knows that death is coming and can't wait to bring it on. I say this is evil, and though I do some nights stay home, I enjoy more the nights when I go out and fight against this ultimate wickedness and ultimate stupidity.
Okay, firstly, I want to state the three main criticisms, as I see them, which have been stated by the new atheist movement or posed by the new atheist movement. And I actually think these criticisms are quite representative of the viewpoints of a large swath of people. The first criticism is that of religious dogmatism that is taken to the point of harming human well-being. To phrase this in a different way, religious observance that is so literal and so strict that it can actually harm people around us. An example of this would be the proclamation from the Catholic Church and the Pope, or the popes throughout the 20th century, who have essentially banned contraception. They've proclaimed that contraception is anathema to the will of God, and that it should not be introduced because it could possibly incentivize premarital sex. And of course, the Catholic Church has its tentacles across the world, and therefore any message that is proclaimed by the Church spreads across the world, particularly where the Church is present. And this proclamation detrimentally impacted millions of people who could have prevented themselves from protracting and procuring sexually transmitted diseases, but didn't, because of the idea that they thought if they use contraception, one of the most revolutionary technological devices of the past century, they would be acting against God's will. Now, this is an example of when dogmatism can be taken to a point where it simply harms the well-being of other human beings. I think another example is the anti-LGBT plus rhetoric that we hear from a lot of people who dogmatically subscribe to their religion. It simply isn't helpful to, criminalize an act of love. And you see this from those who are dogmatically observant in a way that is quite harmful to, I would argue, themselves, but also to those in their community. The second key criticism that I think has been posed against religion by the new atheist movement is that which condemns when religion acts as an impediment to scientific development. And I think the most striking example of this would be the experience of the scientist Galileo. Galileo contributed to the heliocentric discovery that the Earth rotates around the sun rather than vice versa. Of course, the church maintained for a very long time that everything had to rotate around the Earth. The Earth, after all, was the residency of the children of God, and therefore nothing could not be centered around the Earth. It was a rather solipsistic and human-centered way of seeing the cosmos. But Galileo essentially debunked this with his findings. And what happened to Galileo? Essentially, the church condemned him to a life of house arrest, life imprisonment at home. So he spent the rest of his days facing a life charge, as we put it today, as a result of his scientific discovery. The third and final criticism that I'll name in this video is a criticism against religion for religious extremism. An example of religious extremism would be the Salem witch trials, which took place in 16th century America. In this period of time, women who were accused of witchcraft, yes, witchcraft, were subject to the death penalty and hung. Another example would be the Inquisition, which took place in 12th century Europe and onwards, where those who fell outside of Christianity, so religious minorities, were tortured and subject to brutal forms of persecution. The last example of religious extremism that I could name is the type of religious fundamentalism that we've seen over the past 2 decades, starting after 9/11 but amplifying after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think anyone who's thinking honestly, openly, and reasonably would see these as pretty fair and legitimate criticisms of religion. I think the new atheists are correct in pointing to these issues and many other issues with religion and its toxic manifestations. But where I feel the new atheists go wrong or run awry is when they conclude that we'd be better off without religion. Hitchens in his book argues that religion poisons everything. It is simply representative of a former infantile nature of our species. And I think this is when they run into an intellectual cul-de-sac, because I think it doesn't appreciate the complexity of religious traditions. At the end of the day, we are fundamentally primates. We're mammals. But for nearly as long as we've been, religion has been. And this to me means that it speaks to something innate and primordial. Religion has a very complex and I think deep relationship with the Homo sapien. And if this was not the case, it would not be here today and it would not have served us in the ways that it has up until this point. And when I say religion, I don't point to any specific religion. I don't even point to organized religion, because religion has manifested itself in different ways, culturally speaking, across the globe. But kind of looking at it in a Darwinian sense, that if religion did not have evolutionary durability, it would not have stood the test of time and would not be with us today. So the question to ask, I think, from this is, what is it that religion has done for us, which has allowed it to survive for as long as it has? Two things that I think jump to my mind off the bat, and I think two obvious go-to answers to the question that I've posed, is that religion allows us to answer fundamental questions about existence. Questions like, why are we here? Where do we go after we die? What is our meaning and purpose in life? Are we more than a process of guideless, mindless, materialistic transactions and occurrences? Questions like these are questions that we've put forth, again, as long as we've been as Homo sapiens, as a species. So religion has been an attempt to answer these questions, to not only justify existence, but make sense of existence amidst all of the pain that surrounds us in the world. And I get that the scientific rationalists might say, well, questions like why we're here are irrelevant. We don't need answers to those questions. There is no reason why we're here. It's all by chance. And offering an objective scientific answer to the question might suffice in the context of objective scientific truth. But something that I'm going to get onto later is religious truth, and how religious truth is equally as important, in my view, in regards to amplifying the happiness that comes with existence as any other form of truth. But we'll get to that later. The second thing I think is obvious that jumps out from the question that I asked is that religion offers psychological utility. Religion, it provides us with psychological comfort, considering the pain and suffering that surrounds us in the world. There's anarchy and chaos around us, and religion enables us to produce some sort of order and structure despite the chaotic anarchist environment that we're situated in as human beings. But most importantly, and something that I think is far too overlooked in regards to religion, as in terms of religious traditions that we've produced throughout our history, is that what religion has attempted to do is analyze the human story. It's to dramatize the human experience. If you look at sacred texts, it's parables that are told. Why? Because within the parable, with introspection, we can see the underlying themes and motifs and archetypes that emerge from our stories. And from these archetypes and motifs and themes, key principles are distilled around which a religious congregation congregates. And this is one of the key, I think, formational properties that goes into the creation of religious groups. And you see it from Taoism's emphasis on being in harmony with nature, to Jainism's a promotion of non-violence, all the way to the temperance that's promoted by Hinduism. Key principles distilled by common themes of human experience are what forms the crux of a lot of religions. And I think this can tell us a lot, not simply about the religions and how they're composed and what they advocate for, but a lot about ourselves. And in failing to appreciate the edifice of contributions that go into forming religions, many of which aim to fundamentally understand the essence of the human being and to accurately articulate the complexity of the human experience, I think we're undermining the complexity of religion. And I think this is where the new atheists, in my view, go wrong. It would be remiss of me to paint religion in the most perfect light possible and to, share the best possible conceptualizations of religion to make it look good. I've spoken the way that I have thus far, firstly because of the fact that I'm responding to the conclusions of the new atheist, which I think is deeply flawed and limited, but also partially because of my own biases. I was raised in a predominantly Christian environment, and I greatly subscribe to Christianity as a personal philosophy. But, I think it's important for me also to share other ways of seeing religion. A way of seeing religion that fundamentally bases religion on power, which I think is flawed too, but certainly has its place. Mark Twain once said that religion was invented when the first con man met the first fool. And I think there's a lot of validity to such an iteration. My family comes from Nigeria, and I've heard countless stories from Nigeria of pastors speaking to an impoverished congregation and imploring them to pay financial offering, which deceptively goes into enriching the pastors. And they're told to pay this offering because if they pay it now and suffer as they're suffering today in the here and now, in the finite material world, they will guarantee their spot in paradise, where they'll spend eternity with God and all of their relatives. This is what can occur when power is central in religious practice. However, I don't think it's the appropriate way to characterize religion in its totality, albeit an important thing to mention.
Come on to the New Testament. What about the God of the New Testament? Here we have a God who wanted to forgive mankind its sins, including, by the way, the sin of Adam, who he presumably knew perfectly well never existed. Nevertheless, he wanted to forgive mankind's sins. Why didn't he just forgive them? Why was it necessary to have a human sacrifice, to have his son tortured and executed in order that the sins of mankind should be absolved? Is that not the most disgusting?
That was a video of Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist and key figure of the New Atheism movement. And in the video, Dawkins criticizes the idea of God sending his son Jesus Christ into the world to die for the sins of the world. And of course, this is a central tenet of the Christian doctrine. I would argue that Dawkins is reading into the story incorrectly. If you wear binoculars of objective scientific truth and read a story within which rests religious truth, you're not going to be allowed to voyage deep enough into the story to access the religious truth that is there for one to find. Take questions like, did Moses literally defy the laws of physics and split open the Red Sea? Or questions such as, do we have enough archaeological evidence to prove that the Joseph of the Old Testament actually existed? If we're hyper-focused on objectively proving these questions in a scientific context, we're completely evading the deeper religious truths that are embedded in these stories. Truths like this one.
Grounded in. And I do think it's grounded in this hero narrative. But then I look at the hero narrative and I think, well, that's a biologically, that's an emergent narrative. It has evolutionary roots. It's something like man has discovered that his goal is to move into the unknown, to confront what's predatory and dangerous, and to garner something of great value in return and to share it with the community. And it's an ancient story. It echoes through the Old Testament continually. It's even there. It's even there. It lurks underneath the accounts of God's creation itself.
In that video, psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about how the hero narrative, or the archetype of the hero, is pervasive throughout the Old Testament. And I think the story of Moses is testament to that. If we place the story of Moses in a strictly objective scientific context, we're concerned about questions that I think are quite trivial in the context of the story, like whether he actually defied the laws of physics to open up the Red Sea. But if we place it within the context of religious truth, we are then allowed to delve deeply into the story to understand the themes and motifs that pop out from the story and see the underlying messages and lessons that we can take from it. The same applies to the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. If we're concerned with whether we have archaeological truth to prove whether Joseph exists, I'd argue whether you're a believer or non-believer, you're depriving yourself of the ability to take from the allegorical lessons inherent in the story of Joseph about how he stuck to his guts despite negative circumstances, became co-counsel of Egypt alongside Pharaoh, and also forgave his brothers who sold him into slavery, despite the fact that at the end of the story he was in a position of power and could have oppressed his brothers in revenge. I recently listened to a podcast that contrasted two different approaches to morality or values. One approach is called monasticism and another is called moral pluralism. In a monastic system, one particular value is elevated to the highest possible level and one commits themselves absolutely to that value without wavering. Take truth, for example. You might say to yourself that truth is important to you, and therefore you want to commit yourself to truth in every single predicament that you find yourself in. And in some predicaments, that might bode well for you. However, in others, it might not work as well. Christmas is approaching. Take, for example, you going to your grandmom's house for Christmas to eat Christmas cake. Your grandmom puts a lot of work into making the cake and presents it to the family, and you don't quite like how it tastes. And she asks you, how does it taste? Do you like the cake that I've produced? Now, you can tell a white lie and allow your grandmom to be okay with the fact that she tried her best for Christmas, or you can commit to your ideal of truth and open up to her and let her know that you think the cake is horrendous. Now, look, if you take truth as that ultimate value that you can't shift away from, it doesn't allow you to balance other values that may be important to you. Maybe love and forbearance is why you would tell a white lie to your grandmom to allow her to have a happy Christmas and not be dissatisfied with the fact that her grandchild dislikes her cake. Moral pluralism, on the other hand, allows for the juggling of different values simultaneously, so that in each situation you find yourself in, you can allow the most appropriate possible value to come to the forefront of your decision making. So in the case of your grandmom, maybe you won't tell her that her cake was so bad in the name of toleration, kindness, or maybe even familial peace. Now, bearing that in mind, I want you to think about truth, all-encompassing truth with a capital T. There's an amazing proverb from the Jainist religion that perfectly depicts what I'm trying to get at here. Now, imagine 5 people around an elephant. Each person has their eyes closed. One person is holding on to the tail of the elephant. Another person is grabbing onto the stomach of the elephant. The third person is holding on to one of the feet of the elephant. Another person is holding on to the tusk of the elephant, and the last person is holding on to the trunk of the elephant. I remember each person had their eyes closed. Now, after a few moments, each of the people holding on to an aspect or a part of the elephant start shouting out what it is they're holding. And each person's answer is fundamentally different. each thing feels differently. Of course, their answers are going to be different. But the irony in the story is that they're holding on to the same thing. They're just holding on to different aspects of that same thing. Now, I want us to translate this idea to the idea of truth. Objective scientific truth unlocks a fundamental truth related to human existence, but religious truth is something completely different. To demonstrate the difference between religious truth and objective scientific truth, I'm going to take the movie of Pinocchio as an example. In my opinion, the greatest Disney animated movie of all time. If we take an objective scientific-based truth approach to the movie, what we're watching out for are things pertaining to objective scientific fact. And sure, we'll be able to talk about the chemical composition of Pinocchio as a puppet. We'll be able to analyze the biological composition of Geppetto as a human being. We'll be able to assess how the laws of physics were at play throughout the movie, amongst many other things. However, taking a religious truth-based approach to the movie allows us to unlock a different layer of the movie. It allows us to see the motifs and themes that pop up from the movie and distill from that movie principles that we can help ourselves to live meaningful and purposeful lives. In other words, science with a story like Pinocchio will tell us what is, whereas religion will tell us why, what ought to be. And this is why I subscribe greatly to Stephen Jay Golding's idea of two separate magisterium. Within one realm, religion exists, and within another, science exists. And look, religion can't do science as well as science can. And I think this is something that is to be accepted, or atrocities like the oppression of gifted scientists like Galileo occurs. However, it must also be stated that science certainly can't do the job of religion. There's a quote from a very famous African-American poet, whose name I cannot recall, that goes, young man, your arms are too short to box with God." And I think within the world of religion, the job and the purpose of religious traditions, irregardless of the ones that we name, simply cannot be matched by objective scientific truth, simply because they are concerned with radically different things, but things nonetheless that are concerned with truths of our existence. The last question I want to consider in this video is whether we are all religious. And by religious here, I don't mean that we knowingly or unknowingly, explicitly or implicitly subscribe to a particular religious comprehensive belief system. What I mean by this is whether or not we all have, as Pascal put it, a God-shaped hole within us that we need to fill with something. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, talked about how his God-shaped hole was filled with Jesus Christ. And by God here, note that I don't mean it in a religious way. I mean it in terms of a belief in something that is bigger than ourselves. According to practically all the data that monitors this phenomenon, rates of secularism have increased rapidly in Europe. But what has taken its place, I think, is an important question to ask. What is filling the hole in place of the organized religion that we've been so privy to, let's say here in the Western world, but also in other parts of the world where secularism might be increasing? I've certainly seen an increase in spirituality. I actually think data shows that spirituality in place of strict religious observance has actually increased. I've seen more photos and videos of chakras and things pertaining to astrology than I ever did previously. As someone who also operates in the activist/political sphere, I've definitely seen an increase in tribal politics and aggressive types of politics, where politics to some extent fills that hole, which I think has a lot of negative implications too. And of course, we can't overlook the 20th century and what that saw. It saw the hammer and the sickle, the ideology of communism take the place of God in a lot of countries, which allowed people to display the type of religious extremism and fundamentalism that I spoke to earlier. So I think we learned a great deal about the dangers of ideology and how ideology can lead to a lot of destruction if that is allowed to fill the hole. Also, there's also issues pertaining to mental health and belonging amongst a lot of young people in today's time. And of course, I'm not saying that an absence of religion is a causal factor in that regard, but I certainly think variables like this should be considered in regards to proposing solutions to a lot of the problems we face today. God is dead, proclaimed the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And I think there's an element of partial truth in the quote, in that there's a declining rate of religious observance throughout the Western world, but the quote is certainly not absolutely true, in that we can see the influence of religious tradition throughout various sectors of human life. Religious traditions, quite frankly, have helped to inform how we morally perceive the world and has helped to shape a lot of our cultural customs. Religion dates all the way back into antiquity and has formed a fundamental part of the human story. And I think this invokes a certain level of respect and appreciation. Quite frankly, I think analyzing religious culture and religious tradition can benefit us all, believer and non-believer, if we engage with these traditions with nuance, an open mind, and with skepticism. There is something for us all to gain. So my response to the new atheist is that religion is not antithetical to human growth and progression, but is simply an articulation of a certain type of human truth. And to be able to engage with religious truth effectively, we have to ensure that we approach it with humility and a willingness to learn. So this is the video for today, inspired by none other than Christopher Hitchens and his book, God is Not Great. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any opinions about the subject that I discussed or my own insights and perspectives, make sure to let me know in the comment section. And if you want to stay updated, notified about forthcoming uploads, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.